Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure I would like to thank for ICC's invitation. I would like to thank Otavio, Marcelo, all involved in the organization. I have already made available a copy of my presentation in PDF, and you are going to receive a copy of the slides. During this first block, we are going to discuss the global agribusiness industry. Last night, I had the opportunity of talk to Marcelo, and we were talking about the post-pandemic. However, we cannot forget we are still uh, facing the pandemic. We still have a war ongoing. So this has not ended yet. And this is why re- we have effects on the grain, on the protein markets, on the inputs markets. And this is what I'm going to discuss, the global market for grains and animal proteins. So let's start by discussing this forecast for next year. September is we start to consider the next period, 22 to 23, and this is what we expect as the global grain production. One corn represents 1/3, and 15% of corn is used for ethanol production, mostly in the US. However, in Brazil is also growing and also used in China and other countries for ethanol production. Secondly, comes wheat. Wheat was suffered the impact of the war in Ukraine with significant impact on inputs and commodities. The wheat contributes with 20% of global calories. Many started talking about food crises, food scarce. This is happening. I will try to demystify this concept. Third comes rice and wheat. We have a global trend for reduced consumption, not just in Brazil and Latin America, but also globally. In absolute terms, the consumption is growing. However, per capita consumption is reduced, opening space for animal protein. Soybeans is just the fourth grain uh, globally produced in South America, is the top production and the highest area expansion. So, however, demand for soybeans is the one that grows the most. You see here, expansion of global demand, 262% growth in soybean consumption. If the average growth is 98%, wheat and rice are below that level. So we are migrating from rice and wheat to soybean consumption. And soybeans, not just grain, but soybean meal. I'm a veterinarian, but I also graduated in agricultural economics. And I love to analyze the markets. And we have different meals, different oil seeds, sunflower, flax. However, soybeans yield per hectare, comparing the cost per hectare, crude protein and content of meal in the grain is the best result. So 4,000 kilos per hectare, 79% meal, just 2% of hulls and residues. and very high content of crude protein. And this equation is the best in the world for soybeans. So globally, we think that soybeans may be poor in oil compared to canola. It has 48% of oil. Uh, However, we are expanding soybean planted area for the production of meal for animal feed, soybean meal for animal feeds. And also together with DDGs from corn, this these use of these inputs is growing, and we have to understand why wheat is not growing. The last 20 years has been stable. Rice, the blue line, also stable. Cotton, cotton seed is also used for cotton seed meal production. 88%, 46% growth in corn, and global arable land for corn production, 88% growth in soy production. So if you consider Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay, these three countries are responsible for this increased demand, and they are the only ones who still can add arable land for soybean production and expand production. Other countries cannot expand, like North America or Europe or even Southeast Asia. Do we have a scarcity of grain globally? In early 2022, we had 840 million tons of carryover stocks of grain. So the ratio stocks to the supply has been reduced. It's currently at 30%. We have a comfortable stock, 3.5 to 4 months of global consumption. We don't have a food crisis. We have food insecurity. We have almost 1 billion people who have no access to food. We see this in Argentina, in Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, even in Europe, Africa. But there is no scarcity of food. We have reduced purchasing power. Poverty is growing in the US, in Europe, in Latin America, generating problems to access to food. Brazil is the fourth largest grain producer in the world. First comes China, second comes the US with no further area for expansion. Third, India, and Brazil is going to surpass India in the near future. However, Brazil is still very far when compared to China and US. However, we see that in the last 10 years, the global grain production, this is just the compound annual growth rate. Brazil has been growing 5.8% a year. China is not growing, not even 1%. US not even 0.5%. And Brazil is growing at 3 times the global average. And especially when compared to the largest producers, China and US. Protein, Brazil is currently responsible for 25% of global meat exports, 34% in the chicken market, 25% in beef, and advancing now with pork, currently at 13% level. Brazil is responsible as a crucial player in the global supply of meats. Brazil is the largest producer and exporter of soybeans, third largest producer, second largest exporter of corn, and second for major producer. And we're talking about yeast. Brazil is the largest sugar producer in the world. We have a huge production of sugar cane. We produced a lot of ethanol from sugar cane. And most importantly, the largest sugar cane producer occupies 1% of the Brazilian territory. And we don't have one single hectare of sugarcane in the Amazon. Sugarcane is planted in the Midwest and in the Southeast. We are currently facing a La Nina year, a negative surprise for all South American countries. In the last 70 years, we have just twice a sequence of 3 La Ninas in a row. We have a risk of drought in the south, Argentina, south of Brazil, and Paraguay. Argentina has already lost half of the harvest of wheat. 50% of the wheat has been lost. High temperatures, low moisture level in the soil, and Brazil is the same. China, after a historical drought, problems in the US, problems in Europe, and South America is going to be able to produce the commodities for the global supply. This La Nina is expected to, to, to be ended in 3 months, and then rain must be back. So, however, climate is in some aspects unpredictable, but this is the third La Nina in a sequence. And Paraguay is still growing the area used for grain production. Total arable land used is 77.5 million hectares, and 50.5 million hectares are used for 2 or even 3 harvests a year. Corn, soybean, beans, wheat, alfalfa. So soybean production is the red line. Soybeans is produced during summer. Summer corn is no longer planted so intensively. The corn is now planted in the second harvest of the year, started during the 90s, and we are currently at 18 million hectares of corn produced in a second harvest in the same area of land that produced soybeans during the summer. And this results in a privileged condition for producers, for exporters, allowing for production of inputs for feeds and for ethanol. Total production of grain in Brazil, the growth was basically because of increased productivity. So there is a combination of horizontal and vertical growth, resulting in a yearly growth of 5.5% a year. Peak of the prices of agricultural commodities was in February, March, and April, the highest values in history when we do not consider inflation. So all products exploded. So oil seeds, grain, meats, dairy products, sugar. So in June, the prices started to decline, and now they are at a level of 20 to 30% higher level than the historical average, 25 to 30% higher than the historical average. Probably these prices will be maintained in 2023 and 2024. We don't have a scenario of accommodation of these prices to the pre-pandemic levels. We still have high costs. Oil prices are very high. Oil prices affect all the production chains, result in higher freight costs, result in higher production cost of ethanol. So the Brent oil peaked and now is currently at the level of $80, $85 a barrel, much higher than the historical average. Even if we don't consider the global recession with low growth rates in Europe, in the US, and China also having problems to control inflation. Soybeans, corn, and wheat are marketed in according to stock exchange prices in 24 months, considering pandemic effect and the war effect. In dollars, 38.4% in higher prices of soybeans, 64% for corn, and 60% for wheat. So these prices have settled a little bit during this last 12 months, however, have not been reduced to the previous levels. This is the global map of soybeans. The adding all Latin American countries, we are responsible for 53% of the global soybean supply. So participation of South America is growing because we still have area to be expanded. The US is losing share, however, it's not reducing production. Global demand was weakened during the peak of the pandemic with the war, and now China is resuming imports. And one conversation I had with Marcelo last night, one thing it's important to mention, all this inflation in food prices, low levels of investment in China, Germany with negative peak. This inflation has not affected the basic food staples. It's already, we have effects on coffee, on cotton. However, the prices of the major grain are still very high. China resuming imports is the top importer. They are rebuilding their swine herd after ASF. So demand for soybeans and corn is growing. Brazil is going to have, we expect, a huge harvest, 154 million tons. The growth of soybean exports comparing US and Brazil. So it's quite visual. Brazil has been growing 10% a year and the US 4% a year. So we have three peaks that are common in the grain market. All the peaks happened at the same time. The 2008 peak was not related very often. The commodity prices are established by the financial markets. So 2012, the largest drought in the history of the US, the most significant drought, it was a physical factor affecting the commodity market. And now the combination of pandemic plus the war plus logistics issues, so the prices are maintained high, and the same applies to corn and wheat. soybean meal, 0.98% correlation with the American Stock Exchange, Chicago prices. It's it's impossible to have hedge in soybean and corn. You can do a hedge in the Chicago Stock Exchange and then a physical operation here in Brazil. However, we are between harvests here in Brazil, but the curves are following. Brazil is responsible for 11% of the global supply of corn. China is the US, the largest producer. China comes second, and China has to be considered apart. Second largest producer of corn, and the mm, second largest importer of corn. First harvest of corn is losing ground, restricted to the south because of climate issues, where they cannot uh, have a second harvest. Second harvest of corn is produced in the Midwest of the country. This region is not very much affected by droughts or rain. So we are no longer talking about small small harvest, because in the past it was the second harvest of corn was called small harvest. Now it's becoming the major harvest. Brazil is exporting little corn. We have a peak of supply in the second semester of the year. Brazil is the, close to 50 million tons of corn. US still the first. The Brazilian corn export curve, it's quite impressive. The market is totally concentrated in the second harvest of the year, and we have a new buyer of corn, of Brazilian corn. Brazil has grown exports without China effect, and China has currently signed a protocol, the phytosanitary protocol, and is going to buy corn from Brazil. The the first ship has already sailed to China. So it's difficult to measure the impact of China entering this market, but the volumes will be significant. Brazil grows 10% the corn export a year. China deficit and surplus of corn, with they are restocking their swine farms. So after ASF was controlled, and they're starting to import grain. And the second point, the higher demand for corn because of the expansion of ethanol mills producing corn ethanol. Why producing corn ethanol in Brazil if we have sugarcane, we have oil, and the production process of corn ethanol, 1,000 kilos will produce 410 liters of ethanol, but also generates more than 300 kilos of DDGs. So co-generation of energy, we have the residual oil for biodiesel and DDGs. And DDGs have a high content of crude protein. And DDG is being used to replace soybean meal. We don't have a long history of using DDGs here in Brazil, but we clearly see a correlation. The production of corn ethanol, I believe it's going to grow very significant, 2 digits a year. And at the end of the decade we'll have 10 million tons of DDGs available. And also experimental use and feeds here in Brazil. It's a new item that is being tested, and the industries, the production animal industry, they are starting to test this new ingredient. So, and the same applies to sorghum. Here, corn ethanol production, China importing corn, ethanol being produced. What about corn prices? What about the effects on corn prices? At least during this last few months, with the signature of the agreement with China, during everyone asks, oh, consumers will be affected because we have a huge pressure for the demand for corn, for ethanol, when China is going to buy Brazilian corn, so prices will soar. This is a myth in the agribusiness. This is a commodity in the Brazilian port, in the Mexican Gulf, in the Rosario port in Argentina, it's always the same. It's a commodity. So corn prices are established by the global market. Here we see the Brazilian prices slightly higher because Brazil was not exporting at the same level. With this La Nina in 2016, we had low production of corn, and the parity of the Brazilian prices were aligned to the international prices. So China or ethanol are not going to affect the prices. What can happen is maybe we'll reach higher levels. You'll never ever see corn again and so he's in Mato Grosso at $8 per bag. No, forget about these prices. We'll never see that again. It's a commodity and it follows the international markets. When the inflation exploded globally, I was interviewed by a Brazilian TV channel, and and I thought to myself, I will have 40 seconds at the most. I have to deliver my message in the first sentence. And what I told them was, we don't have a food inflation here in Brazil. We have a global food inflation. Soybean oil, it's a commodity. The palm oil, because there was reduced production of palm oil, and this reflected in higher soybean oil prices. We have three peaks: soy, corn. We have three peaks, historically 445, much higher than the historical average. We have a replacement. Sorghum is being grown, more rustic uh, crop. Brazil is the only large beef producer that has no significant production of sorghum. But sorghum is growing very slowly, but concentrated in the Midwest, in the Southeast. And wheat, just understand this price game. We are going to have a higher offer of wheat middlings. We know that we have significant quality requirement, and much of the wheat produced and retained in Ukraine is going to be used for as a byproduct. So Russia and Ukraine concentrate 24% of global exports. The pressures there, we don't know when this war will end. We have a new pandemic now. I was wearing mask in the plane. So the pandemic is still there. And what is important? Wheat, the evolution of the area, planted area and production in Brazil, millions of hectares, production millions of tons. We have people here in the audience that are responsible for changing the scenario. The story of the corn being produced as a second harvest, they identified the best variety that could be planted in brackets during the Brazilian winter. We don't have an actual winter. Wheat, wheat is highly correlated to corn prices. The both go hand in hand. This is the hard wheat for bakery, and we have the soft wheat for pasta, for feeds, and 75% of the wheat is the bakery wheat used in baking. In Brazil, we produce mostly the soft wheat. We export the soft and import the hard. Going to the feed market, obviously, in Brazil, the largest industry is the poultry industry, broilers and layers. So production of feeds per segment here in Brazil, poultry, 43%, and the segment that is significantly growing is beef, is the beef industry and aquaculture, especially tilapia production. The African species is produced in Brazil. The production is growing 10% a year. We still have a significant potential of growth for per capita consumption, and 11% a year is the growth rate of the use of feeds for beef or of dairy cattle, not just in feedlots. Oh, dairy cattle is 6.4%. So just beef cattle is growing 11.2% a year. And Brazil is the largest exporter of beef and volume and is growing. And aquaculture, we we see a significant boom. The capture, the fishing activities from the sea have been stagnating for many years. What we have is a significant growth in inland fish farming. Brazil has one of the largest surface area of water, of fresh water available. Tilapia is being produced like that in freshwater, inland fish farming. It's a very short chain. It's like chicken production. So, and still have a huge potential to be explored in aquaculture, other species, other fish, and so on. Beef, meat production. During the pandemic, there was a reduction in protein consumption. No, there was a reduction, there was a shortage of meats. Beef was short. So China is highly vulnerable. They don't have significant stocks of meat for the domestic market. They are trying to be self-sufficient in pork production. They are building mega swine farms, many stories, trying to reduce reduce the dependence on the imports. And after the effects of ASF, the African swine fever, they're trying to rebuild their farms. Where's the crisis in the global meat market? The food insecurity has not affected the protein markets. We have financial problems. In Brazil, the consumption of eggs and chicken has grown because of the lower income purchasing power of the population. So, for the 440 million of swine that China lost, they lost 265 million pigs because of the pandemic. This was equivalent of all European countries. It's a lot. Okay, China has 1.5 billion people. However, they are rebuilding their swine farms. So China is reducing imports of pork, but beef imports are still maintained and probably they won't be reduced. Pork is being uh, reduced, the dependence on imports. Independent swine producers are leaving the market and the huge farms are being built in China. And the Russian market is now self-sufficient in grain and pork and chicken. Brazil was exporting to Russia, lost this market, now is exporting to China and is losing this market as well for pork exports. The projection of per capita consumption in 2023, US ranks first, 120 kilos per capita per year, Australia more than 100, Brazil a projection for 91 kilos for next year, but the global average is 34 kilos. So we still have a huge potential for growth in Latin America, in China, in India. They can increase the protein consumption of chicken, for example. China is now at the 54 kilo level. It was reduced to 48 kilos during the ASF crisis, but now it's resuming growth. Evolution of the global consumption is advancing 0.5%. Chicken has grown significantly during this last decade. Beef lost 3%. And we now have a market niche of high income social brackets in the Middle East and South and Europe, establishing segments for beef consumption. And the share is changing. So in 10 years, we lost 3% in beef consumption and chicken consumption has grown 5%. So those who are the negative people, they think, oh, beef industry will disappear. No, it's just a segmentation of the market that is happening. We have all these alternative protein markets. It's not growing significantly. They already found their niche. It's not growing. So alternative proteins are stagnated. So in yellow here, you see the fishing and sea yellow. What is really growing is the red portion is aquaculture, the fish farming, and freshwater inland fish farming. Brazil, per capita consumption of meats. We had a stabilization of the economy. We started in 1970, 23 kilos, reached the peak, 43 kilos per capita in 2007, and we are now at this 26 kilo per capita level. So when the prices are affordable, the consumption grows. But we now have a stable situation. And for next year, we expect to see 26 kilos per capita consumption of beef. The value was not lost. Pork was never was never very consumed in Brazil. People still talk about cholesterol, about fat. So these are embedded ideas in the Brazilian population, but it's slowly growing. Chicken is the top one, and eggs from 200 has grown to 260 units per capita per year. So they are capturing a significant share of the animal protein market. Egg consumption is growing. China is the main destination for the Brazilian beef. Projections for 2023, China is the largest importer, largest buyer of soybeans, of cotton, of tobacco, of pork, of chicken, of sugar. So coffee and other commodities have not gotten there yet. So US is fighting for the second place in global beef exports. So US is responsible for 16% of the global beef exports. And this creates a significant differential. We have imports, global imports, excuse me, Japan, South Korea, Chile, European Union, and the main market is still China. There are expectations for slightly lower imports of beef by China in 2023. 3 million tons is about 35 to 40% of the Brazilian beef supply. So they are eating, they are buying almost 40% of what we are producing. Brazil is exporting beef to 162 countries. China is just one of these countries. And apparently they are liking beef. So the Chinese elite is liking beef. The middle class in China has 440 million people. So 440 million in the middle class. Brazil has 100 million people in the middle class. And 25% of Brazilian exports go to China. Australia is 12%. India. And global statistics, they add up beef and buffalo meat. So this is why India ranks here, has a 12% share. US, 12% as well, together with Australia, India, Argentina. But These are the Brazilian exports of beef in the green line, Australia purple, US red, and we don't see any other major player advancing beef exports. Brazil is the only one that is being able to grow beef export. And domestic consumption has not been reduced. We're shortening the cycle. We are implementing technology, growing productivity. So we have highly qualified people who are investing in improving beef production. US is a net exporter. No, it's a net importer. They import more than they export. So they export to the Southeast Asian market, to Europe, and they have and one major competitor with the largest feedlots in the planet. They are net importers. We, the Brazilian cattle herd, 220 million heads. We have 5 million rural properties here in Brazil. Half of them, they are producing food animals. So there's still a significant room to grow feedlot production, grain production, high concentration in the Midwest, and number of feedlots. This last year, we had huge soybean meal prices soaring, corn prices soaring, but now we are projecting an immediate recovery. And we are talking not about lower costs, we are talking about stable prices. So beef producers, the both a large group, large independent producers, they are now learning how to work with these hedge prices of soybean meal, of corn prices, and whenever the market is attractive, they invest in the futures market. It's a market that is still to be explored by Brazil. We have just 12% of the Brazilian beef production coming from feedlots. Huge potential of growth. Maybe because there was no need before. And now 36% of the supply is being exported. So we are less dependent on the prices of the domestic market. So Brazilian exports by destination, 62% of the Brazilian beef went to China. Beef prices, FOB prices in Australia, quite stable prices with a peak in early 2022, now stable, but again, prices much higher than the historical average. And we are still going to see pressure because of grain prices. So finished beef, current prices are still much higher than the historical averages. It's a positive cycle. In 2021, we had a retention of beef cows, and we the market has adjusted a little bit as to prices. Prices are now more stable. Prices are not being significantly reduced. Our domestic market is solid. Unemployment rate has reached 8%, so the economy is slowly growing again. And very briefly, dairy market concentrated in Goiás, southeast and south of Brazil. We have 100,000 producers, 200,000 producers have left this industry, the small ones. Top three dairy industries concentrate 47% of the production, the top 13. This 13 dairy companies, they buy from 13,000 producers. The average production of the dairy farms is close to 500 liters a day. So the small producers are being naturally expelled from this market. Milk prices, we had huge prices during the pandemic. The supply is normalized again and the prices are going back to normal. I the challenge is to watch the clock and to not to forget to tell what's important about the slides. So this is the number of beef per hectare here in Brazil. Stocking rates are being increased. According to the all these the, we have the Brazilian regulation, environmental regulation, which is extremely strict. Yes, you might talk about deforestation in the Amazon, illegal timber. Yes, it happens. We have 4 satellites flying over the Amazon all the time. We still have deforestation. Yes, I agree. Again, we have deforestation, but our regulation is very strict. Unfortunately, this administration had reduced the number of officials responsible for the surveillance. With the new administration, with the new with with the new inspection, the authorities back in full surveillance, we are going to have a lot of pressure to reduce deforestation. We don't see any arguments to protect deforestation. Talk to people. Nobody wants the Amazon forest to be fallen because we will no longer have rain to produce our crops. So, so stocking rate has increased in Brazil. If we divide 1.5 heads per hectare, in some states, Mato Grosso do Sul, Goiás, São Paulo, we have 2.2 heads per hectare. And the average is 0.8 in Piauí and Maranhão. So if the domestic average is 2 animals per hectare, good technology, 2 heads per hectare will be able to have 50 million hectares of pasture areas available for agriculture. And 31% of the country is protected, Indian reservations, permanent protection areas, conservation areas, native forests. 29% of the territory is used, 6% for grain, we use only 6% of our territory for grain. Sugarcane, 1% of the territory. Other crops, 3%. So 10% is used for intensive agriculture. And 158 million hectares of pastures, 18% of the territory, 1.5 heads per hectare. The pressure will be amazing for uh, I was at a meeting in São Paulo, and the producer talked to me, and he was saying that the neighboring area, 3 hectares, and he needed that to allow a better flow at the farm. He paid $25,000. That's the prices and of the corn belt in the US. So we no longer have non-productive areas here in Brazil. We have pasture area. We have pastures that are improved and all the rest. With no pasture management, we are going to have a lot of pressure for to be used for crop production. We have now new models of integrating beef production and crop production. Brazil is going to reduce the area of beef production. We are going to grow productivity without deforestation. Thank you so much. Thank you for your attention.